How's it going, everybody? Today we're going to read some Hume by the way of Paul Russell. So let me just share my screen here. So I'm very interested in Hume, particularly Hume's assessment of causality, because I'm trying to understand the trajectory from Hume to Hegel. How is it and why is it that Kant felt he needed, by necessity, metaphysical necessity, to answer Hume? Why was he so awoken? What is at stakes in Hume's skepticism? Why does it throw us into nihilism? Why does it destroy metaphysics? And I've been wrestling with this for several years now, and I feel like I'm slowly starting to understand Hume in a deeper way. And so, in light of this, I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to show you what I've been reading. But it doesn't want to show up. This is not good. There we go. Okay. So the paper and book that I have been reading, well, I've been mainly reading chapter 12 of Paul Russell's book. Paul Russell's book is the riddle of Hume's treatise. And basically what Paul Russell is arguing here is that the interpretations of Hume's work haven't fully taken into account his atheistic streak. So he gives an overview at the very beginning of what Hume's scholarship is like and the different readings, because there is a debate between scholars as to what actually Hume is arguing for in regards to causality. And if my memory serves me correct, which we'll see in this paper, he's arguing against the realist interpretation, causal realist. So I'm trying to just find a sentence here. Yeah. So atheism and Hume's early critics. Okay. Let's read what we're going to read today, which is this. Matter, omnipotence, and our idea of necessity. 'Tis sufficiently evident from reason that the supreme cause must, of necessity, be infinitely powerful. The only question is what the true meaning of what we call infinite power is. Clark, Demonstration of Being and Attributes to God. So that to begin with, examining the nature of matter and eschewing its inactivity makes the shortest work with atheists of all denominations. Andrew Baxter, Inquiry into the Human Soul. Another important and influential component of Hume's discussion of causation in Treatise 1.3 is his account of the idea of necessary connection, or that concerning the power and efficacy of causes. The interpretation of Hume's intentions on this subject has been much debated in recent years. Whatever interpretation we take, however, this one aspect of Hume's philosophy in the treatise, where the role of God is especially evident, since Hume is explicitly concerned to refute the hypothesis that the operations of matter may be accounted for by the energy of the Supreme Being. Many of Hume's early critics understood his general motivation on the subject to be plainly irreligious or atheistic in character. Despite this, and this is exactly what I've been talking about, contemporary commentators generally pay little attention to this suggestion. In this chapter, I will show that Hume's arguments on this subject do indeed have considerable irreligious significance, and that understanding his motivation in this respect is essential for a proper interpretation of the nature and extent of his skeptical commitments as they relate to causation and necessity. 1. The question concerning our idea of necessary connection or causal powers entered the main debate between theists and atheists in the two closely related contexts. First, there was the question of whether or not we have any idea of God's omnipotence or infinite power, understood as one of the essential attributes of his divine nature. Second, there was the question of how we should understand divine omnipotence in relation to the activity and operations we observe in the universe. That is to say, is omnipotence exercised only in the creation of the material world, or does it also immediately and directly govern the motions and operation of matter? The importance of these two questions for the main debate is evident in Cudworth's true intellectual system of the universe, which aims to decisively confute the philosopher of atheism. Early on in his work, Cudworth categorizes various forms of atheism and identifies two basic forms: the atomical and democratic, and the hylozoic and stratotonical. Both these systems of atheism agree that the first principle or original of all things in the universe is body or matter, but they differ about whether life is essential to matter. So, democratical atheism attributes no life at all to matter and holds that all life and understanding in animals and man is merely accidental and corruptible, arising out of some mixture or modification of it. In contrast with this, stratotonical atheism maintains that all matter has life and perception or understanding, natural or unconscious, essentially belonging to it. Accordingly, in order to confute atheism, Cudworth claims it will suffice to show that 1. Life and understanding can never possibly arise from dead and stupid matter, and 2. Life and understanding are not essential to matter. Cudworth argues that although stratonical atheism is so prodigiously paradoxical and so outrageously wild, the fact is, nevertheless, that Strato's ghost has begun to walk of late. In this way, Cudworth says that the hypothesis that life and understanding is essential to matter has begun already to be looked upon as the rising sun of atheism. While Cudworth aims to refute this atheistic hypothesis, he does not want to reject the suggestion that a plastic life of nature directs the order and motions of matter. These plastic natures are not occult qualities of any kind, but a form of vital energy or mental causality in the world, distinct from God's immediate activity. God uses plastic natures as an instrument to order and regulate the world. On Cudworth's account, therefore, the material universe is neither mechanistic nor directly governed by God. It is rather animated by immaterial powers that God has placed on the world that serve as the instrument of his will. Cudworth argues that there are only two alternatives to accepting his doctrine of plastic natures. Effects in nature must be produced either immediately by God, or there must be some material and mechanical necessity that fortuitously produces them. Cudworth rejects the mechanistic hypothesis on the grounds that it is utterly unconceivable and impossible that such infinite regularity and artificialness as it is everywhere throughout the whole world should constantly result out of the fortuitous motion of nature. Moreover, there are, he claims, phenomena in nature such as the respiration of animals that plainly transcend the powers of mechanism. Cudworth also points out that the mechanistic hypothesis reduces God to an idle spectator of the various results of the fortuitous and necessary actions of bodies. The alternative hypothesis that everything in nature should be done immediately by God himself, although it voids the errors of mechanism, is no more plausible. This would make God a drudge who is incapable of making use of any inferior and subordinate instruments. Moreover, it seems not so agreeable to reason either that nature as a distinct thing from a deity should be quite superseded or made to signify nothing. God himself, doing all things immediately and miraculously, from whence it would follow also that they are also done either forcibly and violently, or else artificially only, and none of them by any inward principle of their own. Since neither of the alternative hypotheses Cudworth has described is acceptable, he concludes that there is a plastic nature under God, which, as an inferior and subordinate instrument, doth drudging execute that part of his providence, which consists in the regular and orderly motion of matter. Cudworth's discussion never identifies who he takes to be the principal proponents of the view that it is God who immediately and miraculously moves matter and bodies in the universe. There is no doubt, however, that in its essentials this is the doctrine of occasionalism, which is most prominently defended by Malebranche. According to Malebranche, there are no forces, powers, or true causes in the material, sensible world. Moreover, not only are bodies incapable of being true causes of whatever exists, the will of minds is incapable of moving the smallest body in the world. For it is clear that there is no necessary connection between our will to move our arm, for example, and the movement of our arms. There are many reasons preventing me from attributing to secondary or natural causes a force, a power, an efficacy to produce anything. But the principal one is that this opinion does not even seem conceivable to me. Whatever effort I make in order to understand it, I cannot find in me any idea representing to me what might be the force or the power they attribute to creatures. Whatever effort of mind I make, I can find force, efficacy, or power only in the will of the infinitely perfect being. Malebranche maintains that a true cause is one such that the mind perceives a necessary connection between it and its effect. It is only in the case of the will of an infinitely perfect being and its effects that we perceive any necessary connection. It follows from this, Malebranche claims that natural causes are not true causes. They are only occasional causes that act only through the force and efficacy of the will of God. And so Malebranche takes himself to have proved that there is only one true cause because there is only one true God. That the nature and power of each thing is nothing but the will of God, and that natural causes are not true causes but only occasional causes. According to Locke's system, in contrast with Malebranche's, powers constitute a great part of our complex ideas of substance. We know substances in the term of their qualities, as when we speak of a body being a thing that is extended, figured, and capable of motion, and a spirit of a thing capable of thinking. In the case of bodies, these qualities are powers to produce ideas in us of primary and secondary qualities. In general, however, our senses are not acute enough to discover the minute particles of bodies and the real constitution on which their sensible qualities depend. Without any knowledge of the real constitution of the minute parts on which the qualities of a substance depend, we cannot discover what other ideas are to be found constantly conjoined with that of our complex ideas of any substance. In all inquiries of this kind, our knowledge reaches very little farther than our experience. Locke's corpuscularian hypothesis is, he claims, that the most intelligible explication of the qualities of bodies, but it reveals only the limits and weaknesses of human understanding with respect to our inability to discover what qualities and powers of bodies have a necessary connection or repugnancy with other. While Locke's corpuscularian hypothesis postulates the existence of hidden or secret powers in bodies, it leaves us with little or no knowledge of the nature of these powers. How then can Locke account for our idea of power? Locke suggests two possible sources of our idea of power. The mind, being every day informed by the senses of the alteration of those simple ideas, it observes in things without, and taking notice how one comes to an end and ceases to be, and another begins to exist which was not before, and concluding from what it has so constantly observed to have been, like like changes will for the future be made. In the same things by like agents, and by like ways considers in one thing the possibility of having any of its simple ideas changed, and in another the possibility of making that change. And so it comes by that idea which we call power. Locke goes on to argue, however, that our observation of the operation of bodies by our senses gives but a very imperfect, obscure idea of active power, since they afford us not any idea in themselves of the power to begin any action, either motion or thought. The idea of beginning motion, Locke maintains, we have only from reflection on what passes in ourselves. We are where we find by experience that barely by willing it, we can move the parts of our body which we were before at rest. Locke's account of the origin of ideas is of obvious relevance, for his spirits are derived from the mind reflecting on its own operations. We derive our idea of God's power, therefore, by enlarging the simple idea of active power we derive from reflection on our own willings. It follows from this that if Malebranche is right, contrary to what Locke claims, and we no more discover an idea of power in our own will than we do in bodies, then Locke's account of how we can frame an idea of this principal attribute of divine natures is without foundation. The teleological significance of this would be obvious to every careful reader of Cudworth's true intellectual system of the universe. In dealing with the first atheistic argument, that the idea of omnipotence is altogether unintelligible, atheists aim to discredit the very possibility of any philosophical understanding of God and his principal attributes. This route, first taken by Lucretius, is advanced at the beginning of Hobbes' Leviathan, the particular target of much of Cudworth's philosophical polemics. Clearly, any philosopher writing in this context and expressing skepticism concerning our idea of infinite power would likely find himself placed in the company of atheists such as Lucretius and Hobbes. In a letter, let me blow my nose. In a letter from a gentleman and the first inquiry, Hume argues that it was never the meaning of Sir Isaac Newton to rob second causes of all force or energy. He also points out, however, that some of Newton's followers have taken on a different turn of thinking. In general, Hume argues the, quote, notion of occasional causes that suppose the universal and sole efficacy of the deity is a hypothesis that had no authority in England. Occasionalism, he claims, is a doctrine that Cudworth, Locke, and Clarke never take notice of, but suppose all along that matter has a real thought, subordinate, and derived power. In the inquiry, however, he notes that this doctrine, as defended by Malebranche and other Cartesians, has become prevalent among our modern metaphysicians. The modern metaphysician in question, as Hume describes them, base their new philosophy on the notion of vis inertia, which they ascribe as to matter. Since matter is inert, they claim we must conclude that it is God's immediate volition and activity, not secondary causes, that govern it. Hume's remarks plainly suggest that Clarke does not belong to among the followers of Newton, or modern physicians who take the occasionalist view. So let's read this again. In the inquiry, however, he notes that this doctrine, as defended by Malebranche and other Cartesians, has become prevalent among our modern philosophers and metaphysicians. The modern metaphysician in question, as Hume describes them, based their new philosophy on the notion of the visa inerta, which they ascribe to matter. Since matter is inert, they claim we must conclude that it is God's immediate volition and activity, not secondary causes, that governs and orders it. Hume's remarks plainly suggest that Clarke does not belong to the followers of Newton or modern metaphysicians who take this occasionalist view. The fact is, nevertheless, that with respect to the visa inerta of matter, Clarke and his followers do indeed hold the occasionalist view that Hume attributes to the modern metaphysicians. It is a fundamental tenet of Clarke's Newtonian system, that matter is inert and incapable of any active powers. By matter, Clarke understands a solid substance capable only of division, figure, and motion. So considered, matter has no real, proper, distinct positive powers, but only negative qualities, deficiencies, or imperfections. In the second part of his discourse, in the context of his discussion of miracles, Clarke explains his views concerning the motion and operation of the material world. All things that are done in the world are done either immediately by God himself or by created intelligent beings, matter being evidently not at all capable of any laws or powers whatsoever, any more than it is capable of intelligence, excepting only this one negative power, that every part of it will, of itself, always and necessarily continue in that state, whether of rest or motion, wherein it at present is. So that all those things we commonly say are the effects of natural powers of matter, and laws of motion, of gravitation, attraction, or the like, are indeed the effects of God's acting upon matter continually and every moment, either immediately by himself or immediately by some created intelligent beings. In this way, it is Clarke's view that the course of nature, truly and properly speaking, is nothing else but the will of God, producing certain effects in a continued, regularly, constant, and uniform manner. Clearly, then, despite Hume's remarks to the contrary, Clarke's account of Newtonian philosophy does indeed ascribe a visa inerta to matter, and maintains that its operations must necessarily be explained in terms of immediate violations of God, or finite immaterial agents who derive their powers from him. Clarke, therefore, plainly belongs among the modern metaphysicians, and there is a significant strain of occasionalism in his Newtonian system of natural philosophy. Right, this is interesting. Clarke views concerning the visa inerta of matter, as well as the teleological confusions he drew from them, constitute the foundation and fabric of Andrew Baxter's whole project in his inquiry into the human soul. In its first section, entitled A Visa Inerta Essential to Matter, Baxter argues that a resistance to any change of its present state is essential to matter and inconsistent with any active power in it. In the section that follows, he draws out the consequence of the want of active powers in matter. This consequence, he claims, are of great weight both in religion and philosophy. He continues, quote, "The chief consequence that offers to us from what hath been said hitherto is the necessity of an immaterial, powerful being, who first made his dead substance matter, originally impressed and still continues to impress motion upon it. The first thing that appears in his nature, as is thus discovered, is his immateriality, being the powerful creator and mover of matter." Baxter applies this reasoning directly against the atheistic philosophy of Hobbes and Spinoza, regarding Spinoza's hypothesis that everything in the world was God. Baxter argues that it is absolutely impossible the same being should be both material and immaterial, or void of all power as matter is, and at once the origin of all power as an immaterial being must be. Hobbes's opinion that there is nothing but matter in the universe is also refuted. For if there were nothing in a universe but a substance which resists all change of its present state to rest or motion, or to which its vis inertia is essential, it is certain no change or state would ever have been effected, nor would there have been a substance in nature to which active power could have belonged. According to Baxter, every other kind of atheism asserts matter to be endued with certain original powers which may supply the absence of a deity or of immaterial being in the world. Baxter claims that his reasoning concerning the vis inertia of matter shows the impossibility of their aesthetic hypothesis at once. His reasoning then turns on the following pair of claims. Matter is incapable of activity. Vis-a-vis vis inertia is an essential property of matter. All effects commonly ascribed to certain natural powers residing in matter are immediately produced by the power of an immaterial being. This reasoning from the inertia of matter, Baxter maintains, makes the shortest work with atheists of all denominations. Baxter repeatedly emphasizes the point that the line of reasoning he pursues in this work is not original with him, but follows the argument as already laid down by Clarke. Although his account of the Clarkean roots of his confutation of atheism is obviously justified, it is also clear that Baxter's view about God's immediate activity in the material world bears some resemblance to Malebranche's occasionalist doctrine, as several commentators have noticed. So let me just say that again. Although this account of Clarkean roots of his confusion of atheism is obviously justified, it is also clear that Baxter's view about God's immediate activity in the material world bears some resemblance to Malebranche's occasionalist doctrine, as several commentators have noticed. In general, occasionalist tendencies were very common among Newton's followers, and Clarke and Baxter were no means unusual in this respect. At the same time, however, other followers of Newton had a very different turn of mind. The most notable and distinguished of these was Colin MacLurian, a prominent Rankian and a professor at Edinburgh University. MacLurian's account, as already explained in Chapter 4, rejects the hypothesis of the operations of nature being governed by God's immediate volitions. Though God is the source of all efficacy, yet we find that place is left for second cause to act in subordination to him, and mechanism has its share in carrying on the great scheme of nature. MacLurian reminds his readers that Newton conjectured that the most noble phenomena in nature are produced by a rare ethereal medium. He continues, it is easy to see that this conjecture no way derogates from the government and influence of the deity, while it leaves us at liberty to pursue our inquiries concerning the nature and operations of such medium. Whereas they who hastily reduce those powers into immediate volitions of the supreme cause without admitting any intermediate instruments put an end to our inquiries at once, and deprive us of what is probably the most sublime part of philosophy by representing it as imaginary and fictitious, by which means we observe above they hurt those very interests which they appear to sanguine to promote. MacLurian's criticism of the doctrine that Baxter defended in his inquiry into the human soul produced a reply from Baxter. His appendix into the inquiry, which was published in 1750, Baxter answers McLuhan by observing that he cannot see how denying the powers of a dead substance is in part pairing the beauty of nature. He also suggests that Newton was too cautious in not ascribing the most noble phenomena in nature to the immediate operation of the deity, when he could find nothing else to ascribe them to, but a subtle elastic medium of the reality of which he owns he has no proof. In general, Baxter argues McLuhan's account of the role of second causes as a consequence of excluding God from the operations of nature, which would conceal the deity from knowledge of mortals forever. These observations make clear that Newtonian natural philosophy was deeply divided on the related questions of active powers in matter and the immediate activity of God in nature. Moreover, this debate was flourishing in Scotland around the time the treatise was first projected and beginning to take shape. The views of Baxter are entirely consistent with the representatives of the views of some followers of Newton and the modern metaphysician Hume is referred to in the Letter from a Gentleman and the First Inquiry. Present-day scholars such as Yalton and Winkler have identified Baxter as being among the more obvious target of Hume's criticism in this context. Nor is it surprising that Baxter's philosophical doctrines should be criticized in the context of Hume's remarks about our modern metaphysicians, as noted. Hume's footnote at the inquiry follows very closely his reply to the fourth charge against him in a letter from a gentleman, where Hume notes that some followers of Newton have adopted the occasional view of Descartes, a Malebranche. The implication of this is that the modern metaphysicians he particularly has in mind in the inquiry are the followers of Newton he had referred to in his letter from a gentleman. Baxter was clearly prominent among this group. Beyond this, I have already shown that Hume's other replies to the charges against him in the specimen should be considered with particular reference to the philosophical principles of Clarke and Baxter. Finally, Hume can hardly have been unaware of Baxter's reputation as a champion of the doctrine of vita inerta, of matter. Apart from anything else, his own immediate friend and mentor had a lengthy and acrimonious exchange with Baxter on precisely this subject a number of years before Baxter's inquiry appeared to him. Two particularly important points emerge from our observation regarding the background debates that framed Hume's discussion of our idea of necessity. The first is that these debates were heavily weighed with theological implications and significance. In particular, the question concerning the inactivity of matter was directly relevant to rival interpretations in the place and the role of God in the operations of nature, a central point of controversy in the main debate. Second, Hume's discussion of this issue must be considered with a view not only to Locke and Malebranche, who he specifically mentions in Treatise 1.3.14, but also to the contributions of Cudworth, Clarke, and the followers of Newton, or modern metaphysicians he refers to in his reply in a letter from a gentleman. Among the most obvious and prominent thinkers of the latter group is Baxter, who championed the doctrine of vita inerta, of matter, as the foundation of his Clarkean confusion of atheism. Okay, so I'm just going to read to this far on this time, and then I'm going to pick it up from 3 the next time. But the main point that we have to keep in mind here is occasionalism and the role of matter. So what is it that we get from this? Well, we're getting the whole point of Paul Russell's book is he's saying, look, Hume is an individual, a philosopher, who's writing at a particular historical time. And there was a massive debate over theological issues, of God, of causality, and specifically causality, because causality is what is actually central to all of these teleological debates. And Hume wants to see, well, is this talk of teleological causality legitimate? So the debate is primarily around occasionalism. So let's have a look at so this is the occasionalist. In general, Hume argues, in the Inquiry, however, he notes that this doctrine, as defended, I know he's talking about occasionalism here, occasionalism, he claims, is a doctrine that could work Locke and Clarke never take notice of, but suppose all along that matter has a real, though subordinate and derived power. In the Inquiry, however, he notes that this doctrine, as defended by Malebranche and other Cartesians, has become prevalent among our modern metaphysicians. The modern metaphysician in question, as Hume describes them, base their new philosophy on the notion of visa inerta, which they ascribe to matter. Since matter is inert, they claim we must conclude that it is God's immediate volition and activity that governs and orders it. Hume's remarks plainly suggest that Clarke does not belong in the followers of Newton, or modern metaphysicians, who take this occasionalist view. And then he goes on, then Russell goes on. In this way, Clarke's view that the course of nature, truly and properly speaking, is nothing else but the will of God producing certain effects, is a continued, regularly, constant, unified matter. Clearly then, despite Hume's remarks to the contrary, Clarke's account of the Newtonian philosophy does indeed describe a visa inerta to matter and maintains its operations. Must necessarily be explained in terms of the immediate volitions of God. Clarke therefore plainly belongs among the modern metaphysicians, and there is a significant strain of occasionalism in his Newtonian system of natural philosophy. Clarke's views concerning the visa inerta of matter, as well as the teleological conclusion he drew from them, constitute the foundation of Andrew Baxter. Okay, so where are we now? So we go, okay. These observations all make very clear that Newtonian natural philosophy is deeply divided on the related question of active powers in matter and the immediate activity of God and nature. Moreover, this debate was flourishing in Scotland around the time the treatise was first projected and beginning to take shape. The views of Baxter are entirely consistent and representative of the views of some followers of Newton and modern metaphysicians. Hume refers to in the letter from a gentleman and the first inquiry. Okay. The implications is that the modern metaphysician he has, particularly in mind in the inquiry, are the followers of Newton he had earlier referred to in the letter from a gentleman. Baxter was clearly prominent among this group. Beyond this, I've already shown, Hume's other replies to the charges against him in the specimen should be considered with particular reference to the philosophical principles of Clarke and Baxter. Finally, Hume can hardly have been unaware Baxter's reputation as a champion of the doctrine of visa inerta of matter. So this is what Russell is really underlining here. So we'll just read a little bit of this and then we'll finish up, okay? Hume's discussion of the origin of our necessity falls into the same pattern as many of his other discussions in the treatise. His search for the impression from which our idea of necessity is derived begins with the critique of several proposals that have been made by other philosophers, followed by his own alternative, constructive accounts of the nature and origin of idea. The first suggestion he considers concerning the efficacy of causes comes from Locke's essay. So the first one is Locke. Locke's suggestion, as Hume proceeds, is that finding from experience that there are several new productions of matter, such as the motion and variation of body, and concluding that there must somewhere be a power capable of producing them, we arrive at last by this reasoning at the idea of power and efficacy. This account on the origin of our idea of necessity, Hume's claim, is the most general and most popular of this explication. Explication of this matter. In reply to this, he argues that if we examine the case of one billiard ball colliding with another moving from its original position of rest, all we discover are the relations of contiguity, priority, and when the experiment is repeated, constant conjunction. Beyond this, however, we cannot discover any quality or principle in bodies in which force and agency is placed. This lack of success in discovering any force or power in known qualities of matter has led philosophers to conclude that the ultimate force and efficacy of nature is perfectly unknown to us. Clearly then, however natural and popular the hypothesis that there exists some force or power in matter, that is not the origin source of the idea of necessity. This is not the origin or source of the idea of necessity. Given that we are unable to derive our idea of necessity from the known qualities of matter, philosophers have been driven to form an alternative hypothesis. Hume describes the Cartesian view in the following terms. Okay, so we have in this paragraph here, that's Hume's critique of Locke. He describes Locke. Locke's suggestions, Hume presents it, is that, quote, finding from experience that there are several new productions in matter, such as the motion and variation of body, and concluding that there must somewhere be a power capable of producing them, we arrive at last by this reasoning at the idea of power and efficacy. Okay? This account of the origin of our idea of necessity, Hume claims, is the most general and most popular explication of this matter. So there we go. And then he brings in the billiard ball example. Then after this, we go into a Cartesian view, where it outlines deity. So it's going to be interesting for me how Russell is going to bring all of this conversation about visa inertia and occasionalism and Malebranche and Clarke and Baxter and McLuhan. Why does the first part, is this first part just the sort of, well, he does actually bring in Locke here. So we have Locke. We mustn't forget that. So Locke's corpusculean hypothesis is, he claims, the most intelligible explication of the quality of bodies, but it reveals only the limits and weaknesses. While Locke's corpusculean postulates the existence of hidden or secret powers in bodies, it leaves us with little knowledge. Right. Okay, so I'll have a look over Locke. We'll read the first few sections again. Okay, well, I'm going to read this paper next time as well. So there'll be maybe 2 or 3 videos on this paper. See you next time.